German project that is trying to present.
Well, try or not, but for me, it was not that one.
I've got to admit that
artistic activity and to facilitate critical reflection, both bilaterally, that is Germany, Korea, or multilaterally, other European countries, or even between. Finally, a project that we did with a contribution as policy organisation on the Franco-German-Korean project. Where we tried to
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ben Vickers, and I'm responsible for curating the Anxious to Share stream. And this panel is called After the Sharing Economy. And joining me on stage is Francesca Pick, Vinay Gupta, and Jaramil. Before we begin with the presentations, I'll just give a kind of short statement as a way of beginning to frame the discussion. And I wanted to commence with a kind of short reflection and a few reference points for this movement that has become known as the sharing economy, how it evolved, and something of its kind of broader positioning. It might be said that to declare an after for the sharing economy might be premature, given that the kinds of companies and startups attached to this term, the likes of Uber and Airbnb, are highly valuated companies of enormous size. But it could be the very implications and outcomes of such successes that raise questions and provocations about the type of sharing that might be represented by these entities and the kind of crumbs that they give in terms of contribution to wealth distribution globally. For the most part, sharing economy businesses and initiatives have generally been characterized by a set of principles that I think that most people at this stage would be familiar with. That's access, not ownership, trust-based marketplaces, and the notion that unused value is wasted value. Despite much of the kind of early stage rhetoric of the sharing economy as putting both people and the planet at the heart of the economic system, or a force that democratizes access to a higher standard of living, in less than a decade, we've seen the sharing economy rapidly become something more akin to a rental economy, with sharing-based platforms such as Airbnb increasingly disintermediating existing services, enforcing their own labor regimes, and reshaping social infrastructure in their own image. Demonstrated perhaps clearly in Berlin with the effect of Airbnb on the rental prices and property prices in the city. And this all kind of happens under the guise of software that continues to sidestep kind of standard regulatory frameworks that would otherwise hold these companies to account. In terms of the kind of short history, a line can be drawn from the logic of network technologies exemplified in the emergence of platforms such as Wikipedia, Couchsurfing, to the initial rupture of the financial crisis in 2008, and the subsequent insurgency of venture capital that was keen to take up the slack through startups and sharing-based business models capable of disrupting existing incumbent power positions. With respect to these unintended consequences, in 2016 it's become obvious that many of these enterprises may not represent what early proponents of the sharing economy may have intended, and with harsh criticism increasingly stacking up over the past years. Some declare it as an example of capitalism's need to find new profit opportunities in aspects of social life once shielded from the market, in which users of the sharing economy companies are organized and expropriated, leading to a kind of greater casualization of labor. And at the more extreme end of opinion, accusations of US corporate imperialism set on destroying international intermediaries and established companies through tech and capital disruption that's free from taxation of national countries. With the likes of Michelle Bowens of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation deeming the sharing economy a mere rental economy that should be held to the same regulatory standards. And so it's kind of acknowledging these positions that the after here is intended to signal more of a disavowal of the companies that it's bred and open up a conversation and a possibility of looking towards new horizons. And it's in this panel that we will go directly to that which concerns the distribution of wealth, how networks might reorganize, and consider ways in which new platforms and technologies might be capable of retaining value rather than funneling and extracting it, with a sort of nod to the recent work of Trebel Schultz and Nathan Schneider on the subject of platform cooperativism, which declared cooperative ownership is the new sharing. And so to take us on that journey, we have today 3 presenters and individuals whose work spans a cross-section of current thinking and direct experience in building network software and playing a critical role in shaping what has passed and what is perhaps to come. Starting with Francesca Pick, a project manager, writer, and speaker interested in how technology can change business, society, and human interaction. Francesca has played an instrumental role in developing the international community and think tank WeShare since 2012, and is chair of WeShare Fest. For those perhaps less familiar, it's important to note that WeShare has played a decisive role in cultivating the communities around the collaborative commons and the sharing economy, and so appropriately we'll open this series of presentations. This will be followed by Vinay Gupta, one of the world's leading experts in infrastructure theory and state failure solutions, and managing global risks, global system risks. He is perhaps best known as the inventor of the Hexier, an award-winning replacement for disaster relief tents. He constructs theoretical models and mapping tools like simple critical infrastructure maps, and as well as helping to start the US National Defense University StarTides program on humanitarian assistance. But in relation to this conversation, Vinay has over the last year been the release coordinator ambassador for the blockchain-based platform Ethereum, and now plays a pivotal role in consensus in the Ethereum Foundation. Closing off this series of presentations will be Jaramel, an artist, theorist, and programmer focused on the liberatory ethics of free software. His work seeks to cross borders between art and code, social activism, research, and development. Currently, his work is focused on the Europe-wide Decent project, which brings together citizen-led organizations that have transformed democracy in the past years, in order to help them to develop the next generation of open-source, distributed, and privacy-aware tools for direct democracy. And so with that short statement made, I'd like to give it over to Francesca.
Thank you, Ben. And hello, everyone. So I think Ben already gave a very good introduction and overview to many of the different topics, but I'd like to take you a step back now, just to sort of set the stage and get us all onto the same page. So the sharing economy, it's been in the media a lot in the last few years, probably too much. If we look at the different discussions and the topics and terms that are used to describe it, no one really knows what they're discussing. So we hear sharing economy, collaborative economy, there's the on-demand economy, the peer economy. I definitely don't want to talk about definitions here. But so just one really brief note, which is interesting to know, is that the Oxford Dictionary last year, for the first time, included the word sharing economy in the dictionary, and they defined it as an economic system in which assets and services are shared between private individuals for free or for a fee, often with the internet. But so this is only one of very many definitions, and what's maybe quite interesting to know is I was recently at the EU Council, and they actually released a paper deciding they're going to talk about the collaborative economy, while the EU Parliament released a paper saying they would talk about the sharing economy. So we can see there's no consensus here at all, and it's important to actually forget this part of the discussion, to look at the real topics behind it. So really briefly, if we just look at the development over the past years and when sharing really came up as a subject. Of course, sharing has existed for decades, but the first real food co-ops actually emerged in the US in the 70s, like the Park Slope Food Co-op. And then we have different platforms emerging, like eBay, which is actually sort of one of the ancient examples I like to mention. of the first peer-to-peer platform, because it basically enabled people to sell used goods with the internet. Then many of you, since we're in Germany, the Mitfahrzentrale, which has been around for really long, so ride sharing, which was then also bought by carpooling and then later grew even larger. Ben already mentioned Wikipedia, couch surfing, and basically a huge explosion of platforms to share everything. So what basically happened is a whole bubble was created over the past few years where many startups and entrepreneurs believed that every little category of sharing that existed could become a whole separate platform. So right here you can actually see this is the Craigslist listing of Berlin. And you can see that there's almost for every category that exists on Craigslist, a whole separate platform emerged that was trying to have its own business model around the sharing of that one object. So, you know, boats, houses, apartments, cars, really anything. And so this really was a bubble. Then, of course, we see that there's different platforms that were very successful, that grew, the ones we've all heard of, BlaBlaCar, which bought the whole market in Europe for ride sharing, Etsy, accommodation rental platform Airbnb, and of course Uber, which everyone knows, the on-demand ride-sharing platform. And so what we can see is basically, as part of this bubble, that over 28 billion have been invested in these startups in the past years, with many of them still growing. But what we see here is just very few large platforms that were successful. And if we look back to all this diversity that you can see here, this was actually very diverse, but very quickly has been diluted to very, very few large winners, one could say, in this space. And so what's important to see is that all of the media attention and also all of the funding has actually been going to collaborative consumption, as we often call it. So that's basically this first row of platforms you can see up here, where technology is transforming how we consume goods. But actually, this development goes much, much further, and basically the democratization through the internet is also happening in the areas of education, production, funding, governance. And basically, this is a part of this economy that is much less visible till now, and also still holds many interesting promises that also touch upon some of the things we're going to talk about related to blockchain later. But so this is actually what we at WeShare usually discuss as our framework. But since the topic today is the sharing economy, very briefly, what were the promises of the sharing economy that in many cases have been disappointed? So on the one hand, we have micro-entrepreneurship. Basically, everyone believed the sharing economy would create new opportunities for flexible jobs. People could rent out everything they own and become entrepreneurs, have new sources of income, and basically become completely independent from traditional companies. Then we have the environmental hopes. Of course, many of these platforms enable us to use unutilized assets and basically use less, consume fewer goods, use public transport in ways that is much more efficient, so filling empty seats in cars, like with ride sharing. And so therefore, it was believed that this would be able to really decrease our environmental footprint. Another important part, creating strong bonds between people. Couchsurfing is the perfect example that's always used, that these platforms would be able to create really strong interpersonal ties and communities between people, and really help fight against this isolation that people often feel when they're living alone in cities. And then lastly, one of the promises that, especially in my community, we really hoped for was the distribution of power, which would be enabled by the internet connecting individuals, taking out the intermediary, and therefore giving them more power than before. But so, what's the reality? Now, this is a bit of a more extreme picture, but it's good to show it to get to see the two sides. Because when we look at Uber, TaskRabbit, many of the different platforms that have become really large, people haven't become empowered. People aren't necessarily micro-entrepreneurs and are getting good wages working on these platforms. They're working under precarious conditions. They're also maybe just waiting to be replaced by a self-driving car as the Uber drivers. And so there's definitely not such a pretty picture as the one that often is painted by these startups as to how they're helping the people that are working for them. Secondly, we have the effect of monopolies. So since we're in a digital space, the larger your platform is, the better it is, the more critical mass you have, and the better it works. So therefore, we have this effect of self-reinforcing traffic, that more and more people come to your platform, and therefore, very, very few large players instead of many small ones. One interesting development that I actually just recently was speaking to the founder of tripping.com, which is an aggregator for home sharing platforms worldwide. And so that's actually an interesting counterexample because their platform actually has as many rentals as Airbnb by aggregating from 10 or 20 different platforms and basically showing them all on one interface. So that's a good example to see maybe there is a way with these type of meta-aggregator search engines to have something that can actually compete with a platform like Airbnb. But it gets very, very hard for a new entrant into this type of market to actually be able to grow as fast as a startup like Airbnb or Uber. Another really important point about environment and lowering consumption is basically that by all of these new platforms enabling people to save money, they're actually often just substituting their consumption with something else. So for instance, since travel is cheaper, they travel more often, they do more air travel, they go home every weekend since BlaBlaCar lets them do that for only €8, for instance, instead of 20. So this is definitely an important effect that needs to be looked at. But it's too early to probably say how bad it really is. And then another really important argument that is always brought up is what is this actually doing to our personal relationships? That we know there's a platform that I could go to and I could actually charge you to rent my car or to borrow my drill, for instance, when before maybe I would just do it for free. So people are afraid that this is transactionalizing our relationships and actually making me see my friends as potential sources of income instead of just being having a community sense and just giving them something out of goodwill and sort of trusting into that system that I will actually just get something back at some point and don't necessarily have to give money. So at WeShare, for the past few years, we've been thinking a lot about these different topics, and especially the real questions that are behind all of this. So, of course, these were two extremes that I was showing, the promises and the reality, and I think we're somewhere in between, and it's not really sure yet where it's actually going to go. So we actually have a big event that we are organizing for the 4th time this year. It's a festival in Paris. And we bring together people to think about these topics every year. And after the gold rush is actually the theme that we announced several months ago, because we feel that we're really at this moment now when we need to think about where can this go and how can this all develop in a way that we actually think that social and environmental problems will actually be addressed. And we won't end up in a situation that is much worse from where we were before. And so, briefly, the two challenges that always come up again in all the discussions within our community and that we really are always sort of stuck on that are the most interesting are basically the question of value distribution. Because when we look at all these different new concepts and innovations, the question is always who is producing the value and who is benefiting from the value being produced. And so the easy example of Uber is that the drivers still get a very low wage, and that if Uber is successful, they do not have any benefit from that. And we need to somehow find new structures that will actually enable the people that are producing the value, that are actually the product, because the users of a peer-to-peer platform are the product, since Uber does not have any inventory, they don't own any cars. How can these people actually have ownership of the platform and have, voting rights or any type of power to be able to decide? One really good example I'd like to mention, because I think it really shows clearly how strong the power really is of these platforms, is, for instance, TaskRabbit. So that's actually is a peer-to-peer services platform where people can offer different services to anyone. And a few years ago, I think, 2 years ago, they changed their algorithm. So there was an automatic system where, if you offered a service, people could type in whatever they were looking for and then they would find you. So the platform decided to sort of change their whole system of how that works. And there were many people that had built up their livelihood on getting income through that platform. And basically, within just a few hours, when they changed that algorithm, suddenly they weren't showing up in search results anymore, and they weren't getting any more business. And so these people hadn't maybe realized that by using this platform, they were actually giving all of the power over their life and being able to pay their bills to this startup that was still pretty small at the time, and are very dependent on that and couldn't actually influence the decision of TaskRabbit to maybe change it again. So I think this is really one of the key issues where we don't have a solution yet, but as Ben mentioned, platform cooperativism is a very interesting movement, thinking about how cooperatives could actually better respond to this kind of need. But there's still very many challenges to be solved there. And so the second important challenge is the future of work. I spent a lot of my time in France, so especially there, this is a really, really hot topic, which I think it is in other places too. But basically the crisis of employment that we're seeing and the need to find new flexible ways of work, but that actually enable people to not be exploited and really benefit and get the value from what they're doing. And so we already see a lot of really interesting new ways of this work happening, but we're still at the beginnings, and it really needs to evolve to be something that really works and could maybe also replace organizations the way we see them today. And so that is also something that at WeShare we think about a lot, because basically our organization is sort of an experimentation hub for new forms of governance and organization. And so what we've been doing actually ever since the beginning is trying to implement new ways of governing ourselves. And we recently actually started an experiment with a startup called Backfeed. So they're actually a startup that's basically working with blockchain, or they're not there yet, but they're in the process of developing a decentralized protocol that runs with blockchain that enables new forms of decentralized coordination between people. And so I can gladly explain it a bit later, also when we're discussing. But so we're sort of running this experiment with the team of the WeShare Fest, so of the conference we organize, where through integrations in different team collaboration tools, we're trying to create an experiment with a new form of evaluating and making contributions within our network. So this is just a screenshot of Slack. So Slack is a team collaboration tool that many people probably know. And so Backfeed has built sort of an integration that enables people to submit contributions through it and evaluate each other. And so, yeah, this is definitely a very interesting experiment. It's really, really new, and it's very early on, because the tools are not very developed yet. And there's a lot of big questions that come up when you start using it. But we're very curious to see how we can help develop it further and basically find new ways that communities and networks can distribute better the value that is created within them. And so, yeah, I'll talk more about that later, maybe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Vinay?
Hi, everybody. So I was a cypherpunk in the 1990s. And, you know, in those days, there was a lot of hope that we were going to be able to have some kind of social change triggered by the widespread adoption of strong encryption, specifically private key encryption or two-key encryption. And it seemed like after 9/11, that entire scene kind of went dormant, and it was, you know, it was just a thing that had been. And that kind of kept going for almost 10 years, and then out of nowhere came this, you know, central bank of the internet, Bitcoin, And all of a sudden, cypherpunk was back in a big way. You know, we had sort of the Assange stuff on one side and Bitcoin on the other, and it seemed like we'd spent about 10 years dormant and then come out swinging. And as we begin to see the kind of much more broad adoption of this blockchain stuff, it's worth understanding that there is a sort of fundamental political ideology behind that stuff. And the cypherpunks never really settled down into an easy-to-define camp. Some were certainly more anarcho-capitalist, some were certainly more anarcho-syndicalist, some were plain anarchists, some were libertarians, and some were just confused. But all of that was a kind of second round of thinking after the primary round of thinking, which is if you give people the right tools, they will have the ability to make their own decisions. So it was an ideology that was largely about freedom, and the divisions within the cypherpunk movement politically were largely about what you expected people to do with their freedom. And that's often kind of glossed over. People don't really understand that there was a unifying ideology to cypherpunk, which was if people had the tools, then they would be free, that came before the discussions about whether cypherpunk was a left or a right movement. So, over the course of that year that I've been kind of back in the stream of this stuff, I started out in a position where I was working for a charity, and I've wound up working for a company and considering, you know, the company as a thing that goes out and makes more companies. So I'm being basically slowly dragged into this kind of, you know, quicksand-like relationship with capitalism in a way that 10 years ago would have made me screamingly uncomfortable, and now just seems to be a fact of life given that the economic conditions in the think tank world are basically decimated. There's nothing left. If you want to do that kind of thinking and survive, there's nothing left in academia. It's extremely hard to make it in the think tank game because they're shrinking and shrinking. So increasingly the kind of Californian ideology that you do your thinking inside of a company has become the mode of life that I have right now. And I can't tell whether that's a disaster or finally growing up. So this is going to be a talk about a little bit about that process and about what, as a kind of, you know, old school dyed-in-the-wool cypherpunk anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist, what I would hope to be able to do to capitalism if I'm going to have to put up with it. So, our starting position, right? We all know where this is. I've never been able to fully settle in with that because, firstly, you know, communism has tried at a state level, turned out to be worse for the environment than capitalism has ever been. And secondly, there's all of this useful stuff that capitalism has produced. We also have an even, you know, worse problem in terms of the critique of capitalism, which is, although we have a very clear understanding of what the fundamental problems are, and I think they can be summed up as this reasonably precisely, you know, ecocide, monopoly and corruption are, you know, these are really bad things, particularly the ecocide. They're problems that may be predominantly to do with industrialization rather than specifically to do with capitalism, because the Soviet Union and China when it was still communist, and, you know, the other kind of movements, even National Socialism, all had a problem that they produced these same problems. So it doesn't seem to matter what political ideology you layer on top of industrialization, it seems that these problems are constant. But the tools have changed, we're in a post-industrial age, maybe things will change. Now, there's a real sticking point in any critique of capitalism as it currently stands, which is this Elon Musk guy, who is clearly doing the work that you would expect an enlightened despot to do without actually being an enlightened despot. Right? You know, you kind of have this notion that you need some kind of vast grand-scale vision, the great man theory of history, and for somebody able to perform great man theory of history, like, okay, I'm going to put the human race on Mars, without it being paired with sovereign authority, is a really, really interesting thing. And so what I'm finding is that it's harder and harder and harder to make a comprehensive critique of capitalism because the bloody thing keeps overperforming. I know, disastrous on one hand, but all this fruit on the other, and I've yet to see a proposal that gets us out of the hole on one side without sacrificing the greatness that's coming on the other. And I'm really personally conflicted about this. I mean, this is a mess in my life right now. So, the old bright green capitalist notion, I can't believe I'm giving a talk about capitalism, it's just terrible. So the old bright green notion, which was a huge part of the kind of early part of the 2000s American stuff. It used to cluster around a blog called World Changing. was that you could basically innovate inside of capitalism until you had a green economy, because at the end of the day, waste is expensive. Anything that you're throwing away, if you could design it out, will save you money, or you can find somebody who thinks it's a product and you can sell it to them. The great mantra was waste is food. In practice, this has not happened very much. What we do with the electronic waste is we dump it in Africa, and then it poisons a bunch of people, but they can't sue, and so we continue to do it. But there was a possibility, there was a framework there, if only we could have executed on it, and maybe we still could. The parts of it that seem tractable using the new tools are basically the monopoly and the corruption. So the monopolies are largely formed by a position where you get to be a hub around which everything else revolves. So the new monopolies, things like Google, are relatively similar in fundamental structure to older monopolies like Visa. And Visa is not actually a monopoly, Google is not actually a monopoly. Instead, you have this kind of power law distribution of assets. So the first thing is, 3, 4, 5, 10 times the size of the second thing, and that relationship always seems to be there. So the possibility is that you have these constructs called smart contracts. And a smart contract is a piece of software that lives inside of a blockchain. So you can't undo it in the same way that you can't undo a transaction. And the contract is visible to everybody in the same way that all the transactions on a blockchain are visible to everybody. And because computers are deterministic, when you run the code, everybody will come out with the same inputs, the same code, the same execution environment, and as a result, the same output. So if we make an agreement and we publish that agreement in the form of a smart contract, everybody will come to the same conclusion about the execution of the agreement. So the agreement is something which is a public trust and operates essentially automatically. So one of the things that might make a substantial dent in the current kind of monopolistic, corrupt, ecocidal capitalism that we seem to be stuck with is that we could get rid of a large class of sort of network-centric natural monopolies by replacing them with smart contracts. And the smart contract is a bedrock for something along the lines of a platform cooperative. It's a bit like a platform cooperative without the platform. What you're left with is direct peer-to-peer collaboration mediated by a very thin layer of software. And if the software doesn't require a massive staff to maintain it, it may just be one of these things where voluntary cooperation or charities even maintain the software platforms that large-scale cooperative behavior is orchestrated through. And I think that that is credible. I think the technology is rapidly maturing to the point where it becomes pretty doable, and I don't have any doubt that this kind of thinking is worth exploring to the point where we do some implementations and try it. Likewise, the corruption. Again, this largely applies to things which are network-centric. So if you're dealing with corruption in, say, the issuing of building codes, it's a lot harder to see. But the notion that you could require really radical transparency by, forcing a set of transactions that you wanted to be fully public into blockchains might actually do a lot about political corruption. If you required politicians to basically have public bank accounts, and everything that goes in and out of those bank accounts is fully visible, we have the technology to do that, and it's completely manifested within the Bitcoin economy right now. So we could take a section of the economy in the same way that we have a charity sector. We could have a transparency sector where we have a set of different rules which apply to entities in a specific class of areas. And if you want to be one of those entities, you have to be completely transparent, and all of your transactions have to be in a permanent, clear public record. And I think that that is just about crazy enough to work. And certainly the technology supports it. So you could imagine a position where people had to enroll into a transparent life 5 years before we were going to let them run for public office, and then we could watch what went in and out of their pockets extremely carefully. It's a notion, right? But a lot of people are living that way already de facto because they've got 100% of their income going through Bitcoin. So it's not that uncommon in the Bitcoin community to see people auditing each other in public by taking a look at somebody else's accounts. Right? There are people that have basically declared themselves charities like Chris Ellis. And if you want to know what's happening in Chris Ellis's bank account, you look at his Bitcoin balances. So, the problem that we have fundamentally is even if all of these tools work just the way that we want them to, we've still got a position where something like 50% of the world's wealth is controlled by 1,000 individuals. So that's a concentration of wealth on the order of, what is that, 3 million to 1, something like that? There's single individuals who've got the same class of assets as 3 billion or more other people, million or more other people, which, when you think about it, is kind of crazy, right? It's like having, a country the size of Sweden have 2 people that have 50% of the assets. And that's the condition that pertains globally. So it seems like even if we were to reinvent this kind of fundamentally fairer capitalism, and I'll talk a little more about what that might look like, even if we were to reinvent that, when you start with this enormous imbalance in basic wealth distribution, it makes it very hard to see how you're not going to see winner keeps winning games that continue to keep this kind of extremely rich elite on top of the situation indefinitely. Right? And this notion that oligarchy, once it's got 50% of the world's assets in tow, essentially has a 51% attack on the economy as a whole. If the super elite own more than half of everything, in the positions where property is power, they will continue to win. And that may mean being able to write the law to suit their own needs to continue holding power. So what I find myself is in a position where I can see a large scope for incremental improvements to market capitalism as it currently exists that will at least make it more tolerable in some areas where I have to contact the bloody thing. I can also see a lot of opportunity for creation of new social forms which might be kind of like in the same way that unmonastery reinvents the monastery as an institution. You could also imagine a reinvented priest class. You have transparent books, we know where all your money goes, we have heavy monitoring of your life, you say you're on our side, now prove it. But I can't see anything that you could do in those kind of frameworks which will do anything about the enormous pre-existing concentrations of capital. So it seems like you still need a redistribution function, and that redistribution function is as controversial as it ever was. So in a sense, the more it changes, the more it stays the same. And I find that to be a very disturbing conclusion, because it seems like, even though we're rapidly entering a kind of post-industrial phase, the core problems from the early days of the Industrial Revolution appear to be with us without any real signs of diluting. And I find that extremely disturbing. The remaining area for explanation that I think is worth sort of one further round of thinking is what happens when we start thinking about ownership of the means of production in the context of ownership of shares in companies. So there's a concept kicking around on the internet in a big way right now called equity crowdfunding. The US government has just legalized a small set of it. And the basic idea is that you have something that looks like Kickstarter, but it allows you to own stock in the thing that you're funding. And the hope is that companies, instead of going to a venture capitalist and raising funds directly from a small group of people who are essentially representatives of the minority global elites, they go directly to their potential customers and raise the money $25 at a time. And if that had happened, you could easily imagine that Facebook could have wound up with a couple of 100,000 people all owning a small sliver of Facebook, rather than having an enormous concentration of ownership. So the possibility is that if you have equity crowdfunding as a common operation, then you wind up with platform cooperatives simply because you have something that has the basic structure of Uber, but it's owned by a combination of its riders and its drivers. And not everybody that rides or drives would be a shareholder, but if a share is a few $1,000s or a few $100s, buying into those systems becomes affordable for the people that care. And that is the condition of companies after they IPO, but generally speaking, after an IPO, most of the wealth is snapped up by things like pension funds, so it's quite hard to get democratic capitalism engaged because the stock ownership is not sufficiently widespread. The final thing that kind of comes out of that potential model is if we were in a position where there was a much wider distribution of equity because these things were equity crowdfunded a lot, you could make an argument that you could democratize ownership of the means of production, which is, after all, a kind of core Marxist tenet. The second thing about this is that it might also spread the kind of asymmetric generation of upside wealth when it occurs. So instead of winding up with one Zuckerberg who is worth whatever it happens to be $10 billion, the founders might wind up worth a few tens of millions each, if that, but many of the people that bought in early would wind up with a check for $50,000 if they sold their share. And that notion of taking this kind of power law generation of wealth thing that seems to be happening inside of these economies and spreading the outcome of that wealth spike on a much wider basis seems like it might produce some really interesting shifts in society, but probably those shifts would be predominantly within the middle class. So I think there is some hope that even within the kind of neoliberal framework that we're stuck in, there will be a kind of softening and broadening of wealth generation and an increasing democratization of capitalism as it stands. I think that's a reasonable thing that might happen. It still seems to leave the bloody problem that you wind up with enormous concentration of wealth at one end of the spectrum because of the heritage wealth which these folks have inherited. And from there, it's not clear what you do other than go to the ballot boxes and redistribute wealth by force. Not satisfactory for an anarchist, but here we are. Thank you.
Do you mind if I stand up? I don't manage to talk sitting well. Unless we are at dinner, and I don't eat standing. Cheap joke. So I'm going to introduce you to a project I've been involved in the last 2-3 years. It's almost at its end. We will draw some conclusions by June. It has been funded by the European Commission, and it has been an amazing journey with all these partners involved. We have tried to observe and interact with on a technological but also on a social research basis with emerging constituencies in Europe that are forming the future, we believe, of what politics will look like across the nations. And basically we came to, in this project initially to analyze how policy making is done, how decisions are taken, and actually how we follow up on the decision taking, which means also how we follow up financially with the decision taken and with the spending that is made on those decisions. So I think you can relate well with what you presented before. It is a crucial thing to have transparency, accountability, to have a sense of ownership also of what happens, also to take decision and to facilitate the emergence of new decisions and not to centralize everything in the hands of a single leader, of a single manager, of a single Excel sheet. So we started focusing, at least with my organization, DynOrg, a very small but very active right now think tank. We started as a partner to focus on the blockchain things. We were very familiar with Bitcoin. Many of us were into the worldwide sensation back then in 2010. And we started to look at it as it looks today. What can we do with all this technology? And one of the things that we really started focusing on was this concept of social proof of work, which led to a total disaster from a technological point of view, because we had to throw out most of the algorithms that were used and are used still on blockchains, because we actually don't care to validate the work of people with a process, an algorithm. This was an artificium because in the phase in which Bitcoin was emerging, we lived in a context in which there was no trust. So the only way to establish trust was a very axiomatic way to just like assume that the rationality is given by who runs this code and who has run it the most at the expenses of natural resources. I can assure you energy companies made a lot of money and are still making a lot of money with that. Basically, you can secure this minting process. So it's not completely wasted energy, but it's an energy that it's needed in a hostile world. So it's substituting basically all the resources that are taken in building a building, making a huge building with very thick walls, with a mint machine, and with armed guards on the perimeter. Then we actually started understanding what is the current crisis, the financial crisis in which we are going in. Seen from that angle is actually the crisis of trust. So if we tackle this crisis of trust with technological means that actually make us swim in a trustless world, it's probably not the long-term solution that we want. We are going to still live without trust. So what is that creates trust, especially at the basis? What is that make people stand in a square in all the cities of the world for weeks camping and not actually stabbing each other in the back and not actually having so much big problems until the police comes and beats them up? So what is this abundance of trust? What can we do with that? And we started understanding also in the language of banks that what we are talking about is actually credit risk mitigation. Now, I'm not at all a banker, and I have more economist experts that work with me, but this is a terminology that actually it's very actual if we have to describe the actual crisis in which we are in. The banks are afraid to lending, there is a lot of toxicity on all the titles that are exchanged, and so we cannot anymore establish who is who, and actually even the people that are honest are paying the price for these toxicities. And also we focus on this problem, which is a little bit of a downer for the hype that the blockchain technologies have. It's quite difficult to call them deterministic nowadays. I mean, at least we need to run multiple copies of them and see what are the results on the longer term, or at least match them to a database. But what we really care is how do we deal with a technology that is so distributed. It's actually quite simple in a way and can be run, but on the longer term, what do we do with it? You can look again at the bigger experiment in the world in this side is Bitcoin. And when the altcoins came out, they all forked the Bitcoin core. But they are hardly maintainable. Only a few are able to actually maintain the pace of the core development, which is fixing several bugs. So we end up with an ecosystem of thousands of altcoins that are not catching up with the new version of the Bitcoin core that has fixed some vulnerabilities that are known. Then they are in the public and they could affect those old code bases. So we had most forks from the 0.8 to the 0.9 and 0.10. Now we are at 0.11 with the core, and 0.12 is about to come out. Now with 0.12 there is a huge discussion in the media with blockchain size, but there is also a discussion that has not yet emerged on the separation of the lib consensus, so the consensus protocol that actually make all the nodes agree. I mean, let me just put it very simple, and this part of the code is being separated and might be maintained, shared across clients or not, but actually will decide and will centralize what we call consensus in the peer-to-peer network. So how can we establish that what we are using among all these blockchain technologies is on the long term? We are afraid we can't. Sorry. We are afraid we can't, and we started from bottom up, actually. That's the decision we took. So we decided to not start from the blockchain technology necessarily. We decided to start from the interface of the people that have with the wallet, with what is called wallet in Bitcoin, and what is called and what is their interaction among themselves. So we started imagining a social wallet that can interact with multiple blockchain backends and that can actually make transparent all the transactions and can insert and can introduce a new way to management, really, for groups of affinity. So we don't envision a global span for this sort of applications. We envision groups that want to use them for their own good, for their own organization, and make transparent and accountable their activity also to the outside, to other organizations. Now imagine there can be a lot done with this sort of approach, be it on a blockchain, be it on a database. Arguably a blockchain will give security, will give the insurance that other organizations can say, okay, this really happened, the activity is validated in a distributed way. But what matters really is that people can self-empower, can stop defending themselves from being disabled, and can really enable themselves to actually grow new organizations. And this is, I think, one of the most important things, challenges of our time, that we can grow new organizations, new forms of rationalities, new forms of liberation that are actually relating ourselves to the world around us, but they are not constantly dealing with the decaying rationality of the existing institutions. So there are many possible examples, and one of them I try to comment with my partner, Deborah Solomon, in an artwork that we published and we exhibit in Amsterdam. It's still open, the exhibition. We will have the finissage on the 14th of February. We called it Entropical, quoting the entropy, the role of entropy as the second law of thermodynamics, which is very important in economy, as declined by Nicolas Gheorghescu-Roegen, a Romanian economist that wrote a lot about the so-called bioeconomy, what we call today. And we also, of course, play with the word of entropy, which is very dear to every cryptographer. Some people almost see it as a divine, transcending intervention, the randomness that you need to actually do the calculations. But the artwork comments on a little bit more. It comments actually to the skew between value systems, between use value and exchange value. The fact that a farmer today, as inspiring can be his or her activity within even a city fabric, has no value, will yield no financial value from his or her activity. Food production is actually worthless unless you do it on a massive scale at the price of quality most often. So there is a situation in which life-supporting systems are actually not regarded at all by the financial sector. And on the other side, we are just going into a craze of abstraction, which arguably is the problem of financiarization, from the production means. So we live in a place in which the financial value is given to completely abstract processes, down to or up to the blockchain that we see nowadays. They are completely abstract, but they deal with trust. So we are taking the discussion that has been very well also described in articles by economists like David Harvey or David Hacken and Christian Marazzi. We are trying to actually find the key between these two, this big differential between these two words, and how to give value to really what counts for the people that are around us and for actual collectives. And how do we distribute the value among these collectives? Not on a global span. Actually, the danger that we face is that of territorialization. We will have to give up a lot of the global span of our actions, but still we might be able to redistribute then the wealth. I'm not sure how much time I have left. I wanted to finish in 15 minutes. So maybe I take already the time to comment about what I heard so far. It is pretty interesting conversation. I really thank you, Ben, for actually putting it critical from the beginning, so that we are not wasting our time, celebrating Uber and Airbnb as being the new thing on the block. That is obviously gone for this audience, and I'm really glad that is so. So I'm very interested in what are also the conversations that were going on this stage, also yesterday with the presentation of the Snowden archives. And now that you mentioned of this notion of neoliberalism and how we can go actually beyond these sort of rationalities. So obviously I come to think of Foucault when I think of neoliberalism, who made probably your same mistake in the Collège de France in '79 in his lessons, when he wanted to describe what he thought was the birth of biopolitics, and ended up basically talking about liberalism for the whole lessons, which was just like the premise. And of course he traced it back to here, to Germany, where ordoliberalism was actually the early formulations of liberalism were born, down to the Lippmann conversations hosted by Walter Lippmann, in which there was a very interesting theoretical formulation in which they said, okay, liberalism is not finished, is unfinished, and should be always progressed, perhaps by institutions that actually observe its progress. Now, I don't know if we can stay within this framework of liberalism. There is one thing, to quote Brian Holmes, is the continental drift that we are facing. So in US, libertarian means a completely different thing in the Americas than it means in Europe and in European countries. Here we had, let's call it a common seed, no? Let's call it this anarcho-socialist sort of formulation. From its sweetest taste of Kropotkin when he talks about mutual aid, and to the really like sort of ethos of actually sharing a place together, caring about each other, sharing is caring, and how it evolved. Now, libertarian in USA, we see it's declined in the worst case by the Tea Party, by these anarcho-capitalist sociopaths that basically have real problems in relating with other people. Here was declined by, mostly by the tradition of social democracy in Europe that tried to progressively anyway like have the state less influencing processes and still have some sort of common knowledge of the infrastructure. So how do we deal with this, first of all, semantic slide will be my first question. How do we deal with the reconjunction of a mutual understanding that actual socialism is not a crime in US and is not the only answer perhaps here after we have seen the feeble attempts in France and in Greece? So I would say that it's a very controversial topic. What we have in front is also a policy-making process that is scary. We have this new startup economy sort of dialectic, which is somehow dangerous, because if you consider that now funding a startup in UK, soon also in the Netherlands, means tax-free investment. So basically we are substituting basically investors are using public money to invest, perhaps even with a revenue in a startup. So we have cultural institutions that have problems in admitting that they also depend from public money, from private money. And on the other side, we have the response of crafty people saying, okay, if we can't deal with you and with these funders, we will do it on our own. But where is the infrastructure that we share in all this? Who maintains the roads if Uber is the only one dealing with the transport system? And who is maintaining actually the trash system if Airbnb is going to be the leveler of this? So I don't think that the startup economy in which we are is actually a good response on the long term, and we have really to start declining perhaps new forms of rationality, because that was the birth of capitalism, and to quote Deleuze and Guattari in the Anti-Oedipus, that was the need for an axiomatic, for a sort of neutral relationship to each other, to destroy the coded societies in which caste was actually making yourself into the same position of your parents, and still proposing new forms of liberation, let's say meritocratic, but do not forget actually what we are leaving behind. And well, our bet is that maybe some parties, some new constituencies, some widely horizontal practices of shaping the reality, of shaping new narratives, they might be possible. They might be the solution. But this we have all to say. We are working together with the Pirate Party in Iceland, with the Podemos in Spain. They had a huge success. Now they are facing this process of institutionalization. After 4 or 5 years, they were in the street, beaten up by the police with the Quinzo de Mayo. So I am really curious to hear what is your opinion about all this. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you did the summary for me, which I'm grateful for. Okay, so how does this all link up? I mean, one of the things that's really pressing in my mind is I think generally with the transmediale audience there is quite a keen understanding for these technologies and a familiarity, but there was something that you said, Vinay, which was if people had the tools, they would be free. And I think, just speaking from personal experience, but I think something that everybody could probably feel in this room, is that there was definitely a sense that we had the tools. And I think it's interesting maybe with this panel in terms of having gone through various cycles, in whether it's in respect to the sharing economy or other kind of horizontalist movements, etc. Maybe it's something of how this panel was structured, but there is this sense that everybody's pushing towards blockchain. And in a way, there are pitches taking place to say, you know, come over here, this is where the insurgency is taking place, or whatever that might represent. But I wonder, in the same way as in decades past, what are the kind of tools or ways of seeing or the axioms that are being used to say that blockchain is that technology, or blockchain is the platform or the protocols, and how do we ensure that actually it's not exactly the same as what we felt about the networked revolutions before they were centralized within Silicon Valley?
I take my stab at it.
Yeah.
I think there is one fundamental difference between the sharing economy platforms and, for instance, the blockchain, which it was never really cracked by the sharing economy, but they pretended to, which is the ownership of production means. So in the moment in which the platform is not owned by the people that use it, then there is a political problem. There is no interaction. Airbnb can shut down your account. It happened to me anytime in the middle of the transaction. They shut it down. It was down for 2 weeks. It was verified account and everything, and I did verify. I sent them, God knows where, my passport to externalized workers somewhere else, probably, mechanical Turks that were, you know, and then they shut down my account, probably after I don't know what, and I told them why, and they reactivated it saying, sorry, it was an error, without the reason. So basically, you really do not own any process, you have no legal rebate on this, whether it disrupts your travel, it leaves you as a homeless for a night or whatever. So the ownership of production means is still, I'm sorry to be so Marxian, but it has to be said somehow, it is still a crucial point. And in the blockchain, miners, somehow, like the people, the participants, actually own the production means.
Well, so I think that there's one important point that maybe hasn't necessarily become clear, which is I think with blockchain we're often talking about, I mean, it's a technology, right? And so when we mention sharing economy platforms or the sharing economy or types of transactions, that's something else. That's not the technology. That can happen on different types of technology. And so one thing that we've definitely come upon also with our experiment with backfeed is that obviously there's many different layers of decentralization, if that's what you want to talk about. And so blockchain is a way to decentralize something technologically and, you know, yes, enable someone to have ownership of production means, for instance, and yeah, someone else not to take control of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're automatically free or that our governance is decentralized. I mean, banks, they're using blockchain, but they're using, you know, them within their closed systems. So, like, I think this can definitely also be used to just make the situation much less open and decentralized than we would actually like to. And so I think that we really shouldn't believe that just because we have this, that this is going to solve our problems, but that it's really us as humans also and how we interact as groups and how we organize that really need to do the work to also figure it out.
It's probably, it would make sense to bring you in terms of those reference to the bank, and maybe, if you can, commenting explicitly on R3.
Sure.
And maybe saying what that is.
So when I'm explaining blockchains, I usually say, look, 1970s, we spent roughly 20 years figuring out databases. And, you know, in the 70s, you know, the cutting edge of technology was shovel everything into a database, bunch of tape drives, big white machine rooms, guys in white coats, all the rest of that. And that is still very much how people think about databases inside of organizations. 1990s, we spent about 20 years basically bunging everything onto the network. It's a very different ethic. It's, you know, everything around Wi-Fi is kind of small, it's at the edge, it's a couple of people hacking away inside of your organization, building your first website in 1996. That's the kind of template for the network-centric model, culturally. The blockchain thing is in many ways the first final reconciliation between networks and databases, in that it's a database which is coterminous with the network. Everywhere the network is, the database is. Everywhere the database is, the network is. And I wrote a big piece that kind of explains this model in a bunch of detail called Programmable Blockchains in Context. So if you really want to sink your teeth into that, look for that. And there's also a talk which kind of explains the same model somewhere. Just look back on my Twitter. R3 comes along, and R3 is a consortium which started out as being, I think, maybe 12 banks, and then the next time you turn around it's 20, then it's 35. I think it's currently at 49, and in all probability it'll wind up being 100 or 200 banks. And that's the body that the banks are using to study all this blockchain stuff, and they recently announced that they're probably going to do a bunch of stuff on Ethereum. Whether that will be the final platform they choose or whether it's just a starting point for research, hard to tell at this point. But they're certainly well, disposed towards Ethereum, and specifically the version of Ethereum that's running on which is open source code running on top of Microsoft's Azure cloud. So this stuff is going corporate incredibly quickly, and a couple of years ago, when I was first thinking about this, I basically suggested that the ambition of the blockchain community ought to be to try and teach the banks all of our bad habits. And now that I see how quickly the banks are getting on top of this stuff, I begin to wonder whether that was a dreadful error. Because if you're ever going to see hypercapitalism make a play for the state, it's a consortium of a couple of thousand global financial institutions and a non-state currency.
Good job.
Whoops.
Maybe, I think that it would be maybe worth zooming out a little bit from the kind of put a blockchain on it, it's going to solve everything kind of dilemma or cause.
If you liked it, you should have put a blockchain on it.
You can people that.
And maybe zoom out, because I think there's also a kind of critical question that has been persistent throughout kind of network technologies, which is this one that was touched on briefly and is a real issue of kind of decentralization and libertarian politics of how do you pay for the roads, and this issue of public goods and public good infrastructure. And I think...
Beard taxes. Right? I mean, this is how, every civilization that's been challenged by this in the past has simply taxed physical property because you can't hide it.
The windows.
The windows, right? Window taxes, beard taxes, door taxes, wall taxes, tax the land, tax the number of buildings, tax the cars. Taxing the hell out of physical assets is probably the response.
Yeah, sure, but as you move away from a moment of centralization, that's not so easy. As you demonstrated in the example of R3 and the potential, I mean, this also goes another way, and I think there's something that would be worth bringing into this discussion as well, and I was kind of surprised that it wasn't mentioned, is the idea of universal basic income, which is one that's kind of increasing quite rapidly now, and is starting to see some uptake. There's a kind of bad Finnish version. There's a slightly less bad Swiss version.
There is a experimentation in Utrecht that started in the Netherlands recently. Yeah.
And
Well, yeah. I mean, I think basic income is definitely a very interesting idea that could maybe help solve this dilemma of having basically, this basis for everyone. That the thing is, I think. What's really difficult about it, where we just don't know what's going to happen, is human motivation and how they work. Because I always say that, I mean, basically in France and Germany, we sort of have basic income in a way because we have unemployment, and it's sort of like a basic income. And so, in a way, you see that unleashes a lot of potential. A lot of the like social innovation and many of the different ecosystems we see, they're only based on the fact that people are living off of unemployment, and basically that way they can actually invest in these projects. So I think that like we should definitely have more trust in the fact that if people had this kind of basic income, they would actually really invest their time in social good. But I feel like there's a bit of there's just this dilemma between maybe everyone is just going to be lazy and rely on the state, and then we won't be productive anymore. So I think the different opinions there are very, very far apart from each other, and I don't really see how we can bring them together, because people are living in silos in terms of their beliefs and their ideologies, and so there's so many things that would need to happen in terms of infrastructure, in terms of government, to really make it happen, that I'm not sure how we could actually get that transition to take place.
But thank you, Ben, for bringing it up. I slightly disagree with the argument of inactivity. I think that whenever someone inactive in the room can be very useful, even if everyone is active. It might mean something, and this presence might really remind us something. Anyway, what I perceive is that in further discussions, also analyzing with some economy colleagues, this recent formulation in Utrecht, is that even that is not exactly what is called basic income by the proponents. So I think you need another panel with actual experts, because I also am not able to, and that's probably why we don't bring it up. We have with Dynorg a project coming up that we are about to start this year. It's Pi News with the University of Trento and Padova and other institutions around mostly the Eastern Europe, Croatia, Hungary and Greece. And it's called Pi News. It means poverty, income and employment news, and we are going to look and work with people that are expert in this field. I think that it's definitely something, a policy that needs to be studied and needs to be applied in several places in Europe if we want to go forward with what we call a society, a peaceful society, because there are other factors that are just strangling people's life, and ultimately, this is about biopolitics. It's about the presence, the very presence of a person within a city, within a space. It is valuable. The relational value of being, of having a Facebook account as a city registration is all capitalized either by a tax evader monopoly, or by a city, or by groups, autonomous groups. And mutual aid, again, it's great. I think if we are to look into basic income, we have to look into what the people in Catalonia are doing with the fair coin formulation, with the Cooperativa Integral de Catalunya, that followed the artistical Prometeic action of Enric Duran, of actually bringing some money to fuel this economy. And now they are providing to each other. They are actually making sure that people can live, eat, and have a roof within their community. And that's astounding. We don't have any other experience in Europe about that. I wonder if there can be a startup doing that. Maybe the next Enric Duran should go around and take venture capital money and just put it into something like this.
It's funny that you mention it, actually, because we were hoping that Enric Duran would join us, but unfortunately, given his good work, he's a fugitive. I realize there's 15 minutes, so I think it would be a good opportunity, particularly given the kind of broad stroke subjects we're dealing with, to open it up to the audience. So if anybody would like to ask a question, there's a microphone here, and I think there's one over there as well. And there is a question.
Yeah, actually there is thank you very much for the presentation, and I just wanted to briefly also respond to your basic income, to what you raised there, to just at least say or point out that there has been a very large-scale experiment with basic income in Canada, which was researched also very extensively, and then the research was not public for a long time because it was aborted because a different government came in. but it's open now. And what they found is that actually, motivation-wise, it worked really, really well. Like, people were using it to do education, for instance, because there was less stress on their life to constantly get a very basic income and stay in that situation. So there, they found out that economically, you know, it was actually a sound idea, even from how the system was at that time. So I just, wanted to add that. Oh, and also that unemployment is not the same as a basic income, because there are so many strings attached, and it's a system that can basically feel very degrading to be in, and thereby disempowering the person receiving it, whereas basic income, I think, can be empowering. So, yeah.
Actually, you put your finger on my kind of misgiving about basic income, is that it redistributes money but not power. It redistributes money but not in a quantity that can, you know, turn into capital. So I don't know how it will work in practice, but I fear that it will wind up with centralization of power and decentralization of income, which is a very Roman model.
At least it will tap into creativity of people that are now, like, not in a position to join any discussion. So.
Yes, that I absolutely agree. And from a human potential perspective, it's clearly a good idea, but I fear that it'll basically defang politics, where people have their basic income, they settle down, they stop asking for change in the structural power areas, and we basically wind up with a long-term oligopoly, which basically pays off the population to sit at home and play in virtual reality all day. Next.
Are there any other questions? That sounds okay to me. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Burak Arıkan. I want to ask a question on decentralization that we're talking about here a lot. I think it's not necessarily something democratic, decentralization or / distributed systems. And this is mostly because I think one is like who designs the protocols they have power, right? And second, I think the network effects, meaning who moves first, who builds their networks first in a seemingly open decentralized system has power. I wonder if you address such issues in, say, Freecoin or other Ethereum projects in general, or in their design or architecture.
So Ethereum takes one concrete step on this, which is that the entity which is getting the code written is a non-profit, so it's a charity. But decentralization of creative work is really, really difficult. And we've yet to see a sort of democratic variant of that. So you can imagine, for example, the kind of malarkey around Bitcoin right now with the Bitcoin XT fork. If there was some mechanism of figuring out what a voter base looks like for Bitcoin, in theory they could form parties, have elections and fund their forks from some kind of central pot. And they could recreate the kind of governance structure akin to a democratic state, which a lot of them would, of course, horrendously object to because they're anarchists or libertarians. But in principle, they could have resolved that problem using a democratic solution. In practice, because you can't establish who should or shouldn't vote, because you don't have any identity information, they're left with a different set of approaches and they can't nail the problem down. I think until you see democratic or better than democratic governance for software development funding channels, it's going to be very difficult to get actual popular control of technology. And you know, it might be another 10 years before people actually get around to doing that stuff properly. But right now you have anarchist modes of production. If you're going to use the democratic or better than democratic modes, it's a whole new set of infrastructure and architecture that has to get built out, both conceptually and technically. And I think it's going to take maybe 10 years.
Thank you, Burak, for this question and for coming into the spotlight, because I think you are one of the pioneers of the protocollariat, maybe we can call it, the user labor quantification, and I wanted to introduce you to René Ridgway, who is sitting here, because it's very hard to meet each other in this thing. You have to talk to each other. In Freecoin, we immediately addressed this. So we took some technical decisions on the code base. First of all, it's not a software, it's not an application, it's a toolkit. So you're supposed to take it and adapt it. And to facilitate this adaptation, we choose a language that is it's stateless, is non-imperative, and we try to, it's a functional language, it's Clojure, it's a dialect of Lisp, so it's fairly easy to learn actually, and also it's very hard to make mistakes as a programmer, since it's completely functional. And basically also we do full test coverage on all the functions, so that if you try to change it, you will see if you broke something into it. And that is our attempt, and I think literacy in code is crucial for what you say.
Next question.
Thank you. To bring a U.S. perspective to this, and actually I'm from San Francisco, and I've been watching a once beautiful and charming city being remade before my eyes by these companies that have, it's not just the money, it's a view of the world coming from Silicon Valley, the techno-sapiens who have this view of the world where they don't have much use for government, they don't have much use for democracy. And I've been at a number of events, I'm a journalist, so I sort of study what many of you are saying and listen to what you're saying, comparing it to what's going on, and things about blockchain and Bitcoin, and it all sounds very intriguing, but I have a hard time grasping what the agenda is. What is it going to turn into? Because in places like San Francisco, there isn't time. I mean, you know, people are being mowed over at a rapid rate. It's coming here. You know, it's not just a matter of certain businesses, but they are remaking what corporations are. You know, if you think about corporations, the trajectory for the last few decades, you had corporations that were vertical powerhouses. Everything was done under one roof: production, design, marketing, development. Then the next generation of corporations, Apple and Nike, outsourced production to low-wage countries, but they kept design and marketing under the house. Now the new corporations are basically a website and an app, and they have a small core of employees who then oversee an army of freelancers, contractors, temps. And the United States version, those people have no safety net at all. The pay is low. It's completely unilateral. They can cut you off the platform at any moment. And so, I mean, we don't have a long time for this, and I want to hear your comment. But to me, in some ways, it comes down to democracy. You have to have democracy, and that's what they're in the process of ripping apart. In the U.S., I've been advocating working at the local level. The federal level is completely broken and will be for some time to come. Some state governments are useful for an agenda, but others not. So I'm kind of curious here. It's different than the U.S., obviously, but what's the plan? I mean, even just broadly speaking, is it more democracy? If it's blockchain and Bitcoin, how are you going to enact that? Or do you have proposals at the Bundestag or at the local level? I don't know. There's not enough time to answer it all, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Well, let me give you the kind of shotgun answer, right? So, four-year electoral democracy hasn't really changed its basic structure in about maybe 300 years in the UK, couple of hundred years in America. You've gradually enfranchised more people, but the pace of democratic decision-making hasn't increased to keep any kind of relationship with what's happening in the world or in society. So what's happened is that the government has gone from being a kind of bleeding-edge representation of the will of the people to being 300 years out of date in its ability to respond to change. Plus, it keeps going basically batshit insane and carpet bombing people in the wrong country when they're taking revenge for terrorist attacks. You know, the US government's killed something like 1 million people that had nothing to do with direct attacks on it in the past 15 years. It's not surprising that the peacenik kind of core political caucus in San Francisco is attempting to detach from the state, given that the state has turned murderous and fascist. Right? Well, although this stuff appears to be taking democratic agency away from people, when their democratic agency is being used for mass murder, it's not surprising that people have lost faith. And I think that it's that core feeling that the state is the enemy. Even if it's democratic, it's still doing the wrong thing on a vastly bloody scale, that is the core fuel for people looking for an escape from democracy. If democracy gives you war and mass murder, and the idea of an escape from democracy into something post-democratic seems increasingly appealing. So I think the core problem here is the massive abuse of power in the US by the military-industrial complex from 9/11 onwards. You know, during the 1990s, when what the federal government was basically delivering was peace and plenty, there was no sense that the kind of dot-com world was at odds with the basic function of democracy in the state. The hardening of political attitudes, government is bad, get rid of it, is based on the fact that government has been just murderous for quite a long time. You know, you look at the CIA Black Sites program with some 40,000 people who've been yanked off the streets in one country or another and held without trial. They have no legal representation. They exist in a legal vacuum. You can't even recover how many of these people they are. It's not that surprising that the San Francisco elite want no part of an institution that produces that as an outcome. And what they're doing is they're taking control of an economic base that will give them the ability to write their own law in the absence of a federal government that's willing to do so in a responsible way. Now, this is not to say it's good for democracy, but it's worth noting that because we have such a broken democratic apparatus, the people that want an appropriate way of governing are rapidly end-running around that. And that's the libertarians, it's Snowden and Assange, it's all of the dot-com stuff, it's all of the cypherpunk stuff, it's all of the anarchist stuff, it's Occupy. Everybody is trying to take their little corner of power away from the state.
Yeah, just one comment regarding Europe, because obviously we were just talking about the US. And I think that unfortunately there is no plan to make sure that we don't end up in a bad situation. But I do think that in Europe, you know, we have a tradition of much stronger social systems, and the government is waking up to this. And there's a lot of cities that are very active. For instance, in Italy, the city of Milan, Bologna, they're putting a lot of funds into supporting basically initiatives that are trying to look more at social and environmental impacts and things like power distribution, wealth distribution. And so I do think that there's a role for Europe to play there, also on the level of the European Union, to try to actually sort of keep the solidarity idea and sort of something that one could call morals, but that's a hard word, to sort of figure out how this can go in a good direction.
I think of Bertolt Brecht when he uses this term, a German term that Walter Benjamin quotes in his book, is Umfunktionierung, and he was meaning the possibility to change the actual message, to evolve the message in theater as the technology of theater goes on. And now I'm putting it very, very simple, and I'm not the right person to do this quote, but basically he was meaning in theater we can have like some progress also in technology, but every technological progress means also an opportunity, not necessarily progress in a social sense, in the social message that we give. So perhaps another scenario could be the one of no conflict into this, in wasted opportunities. Perhaps it's a scenario in which we are wasting the opportunity to use this technological sense in a social way, in a social direction. And I believe that many of your fellow citizens in the upper caste are believing they do really good by eliminating society from the equation, just like automating it or making it an algorithm. And perhaps there is still an opportunity to be played there, perhaps in really like having a negotiation with them, making them understand that they are wasting an opportunity and facing them with the real results of their actions. So I'm also trying to be optimistic.
Okay, so we have one more question and then we have to end.
Yeah, it's more of a small comment. Keeping the optimistic and the optimism of the participation and the openness, I just wanted to go back to the small detail that you mentioned, that actually there's an accumulation of capital that goes to 98% of poor people in the world, or whatever you can call it, but really. Numbers are not fixed on this issue, that it goes growing up to our liberal societies directly coming from colonialism that developed our technocratic societies. And I find it almost freaking to think that this could be solved by only transparency.
Let's end it there. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to the speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you.